just want to start, first of all, by welcoming everyone on behalf of 3CT, and also to thank Anu and Tormi, who's done really a fantastic job of setting up this event. Many of you here will know Keith through his published work. Of course, he's published widely and influentially on any number of topics, ranging from what became known as the informal economy, to his Ghanaian ethnography, to reflections on money, systems of communication, and the mediation of human relationships in general in an increasingly globalized world. Keith is really, I would say, sort of the embodiment of sort of the Kantian global citizen, not just in his intellectual projects, but because he's taught at a staggering variety of campuses around the world. Several UK universities, several US universities, in Jamaica, in South Africa, and continental Europe. My own relationship with Keith goes back now to cover more than half my life at this point. He was, I would want to say that he was certainly my first and most important teacher of anthropology. As undergraduates at Cambridge, my cohort really experienced Keith's teaching as the very antithesis of scholarly pedantry. With Keith at the helm, anthropology was very much a project not of rejecting the Enlightenment project, as so many were doing in the name of critical theory, but rather of revitalizing it through a kind of radicalization from within. In a recent exchange just a few days ago, Keith described himself as a dialectical humanist, and I think that's actually quite apt. He is a humanist in the sense that he sees anthropology as the pursuit of what Hobbes called commonwealth, that is, the pursuit of social forms that will enable the maximum vitalization of our individual and common creative energies. But he is a dialectician too, because he has always refused both all intellectualist shortcuts to universal truths and the temptation of falling back on the romance of the local. His work on markets, money, and human relationships has always stressed how intimacy and alienation produce each other, and how the very same institutions that close us off from one another can be remobilized to create new forms of community and connection. I hope Keith won't think me silly or feel too embarrassed if I remind him that as a student, we were all very proud that he was our teacher. Whenever he was giving a lecture, we, his advisees, would look around at the other students and kind of nod at each other like, that's our guy up there. I'm sure that we were much more intolerable than we actually realized at the time. But the point is that 20 years later, I still feel exactly the same way when I read Keith's writing and when I see him in action. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome him before you here today. Keith Hart.
My title is Beyond National Capitalism, ? My basic premise is that humanity is caught between national and world society rather uneasily. This constitutes danger and opportunity for us, and it's an important framework for my anthropology that I should place myself between in that way. What I want to discuss today is what I take to be the dominant global social form for the last 1.5 centuries, which I call national capitalism. Towards the end of its reign, national capitalism created world society in the image of the old regime as a violent and unequal society. And this leads me to raise the question of whether perhaps there might be grounds for another liberal revolution against this degenerate form, this old regime. If there is a possibility of such a revolution, then it will be based on social forces that have been built up recently, and these social forces will have to find new forms of political association, which I think is the most pressing problem. So my talk is, apart from these introductory remarks, is going to be based on, is going to take the form of 3 sections. The first will concern the origins of national capitalism. The second will look at its subsequent development to the present day. And the third will be concerned with questions of what might happen next. But before I launch into all that, I wanted to make some brief remarks about my approach to money. My money is archetypically impersonal. It has to be in order to connect us to the widest universe of our social relations. But I have argued that we do develop personal relations with impersonal social forms, and so do we with money. So for me, money, I mean, if you have some money, you can do anything with it. It has infinite potential. But as soon as you use it, say, to purchase something, you close off that possibility. So it's this ability to mediate between finite determination and infinite potential that constitutes for me the most important feature of money, and one that it perhaps shares with language and religion in its own way and some similar ways. In other words, in a world which sometimes glorifies money and sometimes demonizes it, what I have been looking for and is some of its redemptive qualities, because I believe that money is essential to any future civilization that we would wish to be part of. And yet it's also highly oppressive in the forms that we encounter it today. Okay, my definition of national capitalism is the use of central bureaucracy to manage accumulation, markets and money. National capitalism is the institutional synthesis of the nation-state and industrial capitalism in the mid-19th century. It was launched by an alliance of capitalists and landlords. As you know, the original bourgeois or liberal revolution was launched by capitalists in some presumptive alliance with the workers against the landlord class. But having succeeded, and this was of course the project of classical political economy, but having by the middle of the 19th century in Britain and some other places succeeded in launching industrial capitalism quite strongly, they faced, the capitalists faced a burgeoning urban mass that needed to be controlled, disciplined, absorbed, or whatever. And so in a series of linked political revolutions of the 1860s, leaking over into the early 1870s, national capitalism was born in all the countries that became the leading players in 20th century history. And the two classes that formed its launching combined between them the universality of money, money's ability to extend social relations universally, and the classical ability of the military aristocracy to control territory, to act as agents of crowd control, if you like. Now, the urban masses that they had to deal with on an unprecedented scale constituted, of course, the industrial working class. I mean, mechanization did concentrate very large numbers of proletarians in cities, but there was also a very significant problem of criminal gangs in many of the leading cities, and they needed to be controlled as well. I don't know many works of fiction that capture the birth of national capitalism, but one of them is Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York, which was a film made on the basis of a book by Herbert Asbury of the same name. This film starts in 1863 in the middle of the American Civil War, which was by far the most important of the revolutions that I'm talking about, and I will list them soon. It opens up with rows of coffins on the side of the docks in New York City, and Irish immigrants being recruited as they stepped off the ship to join the army and find their own place in one of these coffins. And the film is about this extraordinary turning point in American history in New York. Around that time, conscription was introduced because the Union Army was in dire straits, and this provoked street riots. The army marched down Fifth Avenue, shooting indiscriminately into crowds. It spilled over into America's first race riots, largely Irish, poor Irish, lynching black refugees from the South who were offering unwelcome competition at the lower end of the labour market. And to crown it all, the Union Navy bombed southern Manhattan from the East River, from battleships, as a way of subduing a territory that was under the control of criminal gangs, Irish in the main. The film ends rather beautifully, I think, with Leonardo DiCaprio and his girlfriend sitting on the other side of the East River next to some tombs of friends and relatives who've been killed in this episode. And they look over towards Manhattan as it was then. And the last shots of the movie, Scorsese fades in the contemporary Manhattan skyline, reminding us that New York's variant of capitalism had this rather violent and brutal origin. What it reminded me, of course, is that we know that the American Civil War was, as it were, the struggle of the industrial bourgeoisie against the slave-owning aristocracy, and perhaps also had an agenda of disciplining the working class. But there were other issues that had to be resolved at that time. And of course, in London, in the 60s and 70s, similar developments, but perhaps less extreme methods, were present. So to validate my idea that these revolutions were linked, I'll just tell you what the events were that I considered to be these linked revolutions launching national capitalism. The American Civil War was by far the most important one. In 1861, in the same year, Russia abolished serfdom, and the Italian Risorgimento was consummated. Later, the Japanese had their Meiji Restoration, the British introduced their the Second Reform Act and various democratic reforms, and perhaps even more significantly launched the Anglo-Indian superstate in 1870. Germany, of course, was unified at the end of the decade, immediately launched the Franco-Prussian War, and after that the French Third Republic arose from the ruins of that war. And of course, in the same decade, Marx published the first volume of Capital, and the first international was formed in 1864. So what it suggests is that all of these things, although apparently independent, were taking place in a way that suggested world society had some measure of linkage. Although Arthur Lewis, in his economic history of the period, suggests that virtually almost all countries had a maximum of 1% of GDP attributed to foreign trade. And even in Britain, the linchpin of the global economy, the most reliable indicator of annual economic performance in 1870 was the weather at harvest time. What was the nature of this alliance? Obviously, the capitalists had launched a successful machine revolution, concentrating more and more workers together in urban centres of production. What they needed was an adequate threat of punishment, both for workers who wished to be independent in their conduct, and also to secure contracts of all kinds, how to make a plausible threat if people didn't pay up, for example. They needed, in other words, armies, prisons, police, and all the apparatus of coercion, and were not in the position to supply this themselves. And so, after at least a century and a half in which the liberal agenda was based on the assumption that most workers' interests were identical with those of capital against the rentier military landowning class, the capitalists ganged up with that class in order to secure some kind of control of the situation that they launched. But it wasn't just a coercive regime, although violence certainly was intrinsic to its birth and reproduction. National capitalism also rested on co-option of the working class. And this was by cultural and social means. In other words, the nation-state mobilized its citizens by reference to national culture, and at a very early stage moves were taken to extend social security to at least some sections of the working class. I mean, Germany is by far the most striking example of this form, although it exists in all the countries that I've mentioned. Germany was an alliance between the Prussian Junkers of Berlin, the military, and with Berlin-based bureaucracy, and the Rhineland bourgeoisie. So that that duality was very explicit in Germany. Something similar occurred in Japan at around the same time. Bismarck, as you know, apart from being a soldier in his career as a statesman, launched the first systematic measures of social security, unemployment benefits, and so on, the beginnings of the welfare state. So, and of course Germany played a very significant role in launching cultural nationalism as a means of mobilizing and unifying people divided into various political entities. I mean, one of the things in my work that it's banal in a way, but I want to remind you how powerful the nation-state is and has been as a form of human community. And it's powerful because it unifies several senses in which we can mobilize community. First of all, it's a political community. It creates a body of citizens. Secondly, it's a community of interest, mobilizing its people in war and trade. It's a territorial community, a community of place with definite boundaries between inside and outside. And it's a virtual or imagined community, a nation that has to be fabricated by one means or another. And it's not obvious that these four things should necessarily overlap. And indeed, one of the principal symbols of this overlap is the formation of national monopoly currencies around this time. I mean, this has been so durable and omnipresent for us that it's counterintuitive, I think, for us to realize that everywhere in the world before the 1850s, human societies combine multiple currencies derived from various sources. Polanyi, in his discourse on money, pointed out that it was only really at this time that the four functions of money as means of exchange, standard means of payment, and store, these four things came to be embodied in a single monetary instrument. He argued that you could not write the origins and development of the history of money unless you broke up these four functions and showed the history of each separately. And there's some interesting work being done recently suggesting that even though it was as recent as this, that national monopoly currencies may be breaking up again, and the functions may no longer be unified in the way they were. So it becomes a very it becomes a major analytical problem as well as a political one for us to try to identify the different forms of community, the different functions of institutions like money, and to think of them in plural rather than centralized and unified terms. It's my premise that the future that we may be entering will involve such a shift. Okay, let me talk now about the historical periodization of national capitalism. I'm claiming that its origins were in the 1860s and the early 70s. I then identify 4 phases. One was from the 1880s to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Then there was the period that Churchill referred to as the Second 30 Years' War, from 1914 to 1945. Then after 45 until the 70s, another phase, and then from the 80s until now, the 4th. And I think many of us feel and are prepared intellectually to embrace the possibility that we're in 2008 and 9 we're living through the end of that phase and the beginning of something else. So let me describe briefly these 4 phases. The first phase saw what we might call a bureaucratic revolution. This was the period in which strongly centralized states were formed, and the new legal framework for conducting business was developed. This was the period, just to take the United States in the 1880s, where corporations, using the 14th Amendment, won the right to be treated as individual citizens. So this period of the late 19th, early 20th century saw the emergence of a new bureaucratic and institutional form of the alliance that had launched national capitalism. It was a period also when central banks took their definitive shape and began to organize finance domestically. But this period of the 3 decades before the First World War was marked mainly by extraordinary international movement. This was the period of the greatest migration of Europeans and Asians. It was a period of financial imperialism, not unlike the one that we've just come through. In other words, what we saw in this period was the development of strengthened bureaucratic institutions, the shift towards large-scale government and business organization, mass production, mass consumption. This was the period also when department stores came into being, and buying and selling moved from the shop floor to a remote managerial apparatus. This is the period when fixed posted prices replaced haggling over credit with the shopkeeper, for the simple reason that the people selling on the shop floor had to be controlled remotely. But it was also, as I say, a period of globalization, as we would call it today, and marked by what Polanyi referred to as haute finance, by which he really meant the Rothschilds. And although it was a period in which national expansion and imperial territorial control led to considerable conflict between the principal powers, I mean, essentially provoked by the extraordinary combination of Britain and India as a single political power. Nevertheless, this was a period of general peace between the powers. The First World War revealed, I think for the first time, what this institutional complex was capable of. People didn't really believe it before, and it was still the case that liberal economics held the sway of most people's minds. In other words, people hadn't yet worked out what these institutions could be used for, but the First World War demonstrated in no uncertain terms what had been unleashed. I mean, states recruited and killed off huge armies, They controlled production and trade. They mobilized hitherto unknown instruments of propaganda. So that by the end of the First World War, it was very clear that something had been launched that had powers that had been undreamt of before it. And so in the period after the First World War, various forms of this new state variant of national capitalism vied with each other for, essentially, for world dominance, as you know. Fascism, communism, and welfare democracy, if you want to call it that. In any case, the period between the wars was, and the two wars themselves were, an unmitigated disaster, economic, political, moral, and so on. So by the time it was all over, the winner was national capitalism. Well, that wasn't so difficult, since all the three contenders were variants of national capitalism. Communism under Stalin had become a form of state capitalism in one country. Fascism obviously was an extreme nationalist version of national capitalism, and welfare state capitalism, welfare state democracy was the, perhaps we would say, the more benign variant of this form. And indeed it was this last one, in some uneasy relationship with the Soviet Union, that emerged victorious from the 30 Years' War. Eric Hobsbawm, in his book An Age of Extremes, the short 20th century, refers to the period from 1948 to 73 as a golden age. It certainly was, if you consider the world from the point of view of the principal agents of national capitalism. It succeeded, the Rooseveltian consensus succeeded because a coalition of the leading industrial states, including the vanquished Germany and Japan, essentially agreed simultaneously to expand public expenditure, thereby creating the largest coordinated boom in trade ever. But of course this was also the period of the Cold War. I mean, before we get nostalgic about the trade boom and the general prosperity that what the French call les 30 glorieuses from 1945 to 75, this was also a period in which most of us wondered whether we would survive the next year as a result of the threat of nuclear holocaust. And I think one of the issues that we have to face, and that perhaps I won't be developing so well today, is what was the relationship between this period and the one that followed it, the period that we refer to rather glibly as neoliberalism. I'll be coming back to that question. The last 3 decades, you could essentially consider them to be a revival of financial imperialism of the sort that existed before the First World War. It was also, I would argue, a period in which world society was drawn palpably together. I guess that's the meaning of globalization, that the world seems to be drawing closer. I mean, it seemed to be drawing closer in the time of the French Revolution and Kant and the abolition movements and so on, it certainly was drawing closer in the decades before the First World War. And the last 3 decades have a similar. Nevertheless, and I can't really take the time now to demonstrate my point, would like to argue that world society has been formed concretely to a degree that it never had before. That is to say, the formation of a single unified social network is a feature of really the last 2 or 3 decades. I mean, the whole period since the Second World War contributed to this. I mean, the space race in the 1960s allowed us to see the world from the outside for the first time, which I think has enormous symbolic significance. But I would like to focus on 3 developments of the last 2 decades as particularly important in this respect. The first was the collapse of the Soviet Union, opening up the world as a whole to transnational capitalism. The second was the entry of the peoples of India and China, the 2 billion or more of them, into world economy as powers in their own right for the first time. And the third, of course, was the digital revolution in communications, whose most palpable symbol is the internet, the collapse of time and distance in the formation of a new digital network of communications. But this period, the last 3 decades, was also one in which the aspirations of the post-war consensus, the period after 1945, were really quite seriously let down. The late 40s saw not only the formation of the United Nations, but also the launching of the anti-colonial revolution in Asia, to be followed later in Africa and other places. And I think that the experience of the 30 Years' War led my parents' generation quite decisively to reject most of what they had been asked to live by in the period before then, and to make a very serious attempt to redress the inequality of world society through what I consider now to be serious programs of development and of course emancipatory reforms, including independence from colonial rule. The last 3 decades, on the other hand, have seen a reversion to inequality on an impressive scale, and to lawlessness and an abandonment of the democratic consensus of the late 40s, which, as you all know, took an extreme form in the last decade, when I think the form of the old regime was recreated quite explicitly with the second Bush and Halliburton reliably occupying the slots of George III and the East India Company. Okay, let me go on to how we might begin to think about where to go from here. I have taken from various sources, especially Marcel Mauss and Karl Polanyi, the idea that one of the principal functions of money and markets is the extension of society beyond its local form. That is to say that society usually takes some kind of territorial form, but these places are never self-sufficient. They must engage with the rest of the world, and in order to do so they have to find a variety of instruments for trading with them, and whether we call them money or markets or insist on differentiating them was an issue that Mose took up with Malinowski. He found it convenient to describe the Kula ring, for example, as a market organized by money. But in any case, the extension of money and markets that took place in the last 3 decades has a positive as well as a negative side. We know the negative side. It's very easy to see that as society loosened its moorings in the nation state, those who controlled access to finance enjoyed the opportunity to enrich themselves in a deregulated way. There's no question about that. And they did so in ways that endangered us all and that we're now suffering from. But there is a positive side to this, something like the credit boom that we've gone through. It was a period in which markets were extended and integrated on a scale that had never been known before. And I find some interest in comparing the last 3 decades with other booms and busts in the history of capitalism over several hundred years. I mean, for example, the railway booms of the mid-19th century, the various gold strikes, the wild rubber boom, earlier the tulips and South Sea bubbles and so on. I mean, all of these can be described as irrational exuberance or animal spirits, naked greed, or whatever you want to call it, leading to tears before bedtime. But there were always solid institutional residues of these things. I mean, we did get continental railways, we got industrial uses of rubber, we got colonial empires, stock exchanges, a gold standard, a mildly inflationary gold standard that sustained world trade for a number of decades. So I think it's important to, before we launch some vendetta against the people who enrich themselves unconscionably at our expense in this period, we need to reflect on which aspects of the global economy they created we wish to retain, or whether we wish to return to the fragmentation and narrowness of the society that preceded it. In any case, the fallout of the crisis that we're living through is that private capital, especially the banks, have been severely weakened. If we're thinking of the 2 planks, as it were, the alliance between big money and state power that launched national capitalism, private capital, especially the banking system, has been severely weakened. The initial knee-jerk reaction is to turn to the political institutions, the national governments, the central banks, alone and in alliance, to try and solve the problem using varieties of Keynesian macroeconomic techniques. I'm convinced that these will fail. I can't believe that the political class that supervised what we've just been through will have the flexibility or the nous to get us out of where we are now. And if they do fail, which I confidently expect they will, then both sides of the national, the alliance that formed national capitalism would be in disarray. And of course, it's not just the institutional power of classes, but the intellectual hegemony of liberal economics has been damaged irreparably. Their slogan of Tina, there is no alternative than an extremely narrow conception of how to run a market economy. Call it market fundamentalism if you like. That has been damaged, I would say, at least for a century. And as I've said, nor is it likely that a simple reversion to Keynesian solutions drawn from the 1930s will work, because in the 1930s economies were still substantially national entities, and the techniques of manipulation he developed were suited to that. I don't think that our economies are national in the same way anymore. And so what I am looking towards is a more plural approach to economy, certainly not to a radical revolutionary agenda which says that we can move in one leap from national capitalism to its opposite. I believe that both Mose and Polanyi argued that all the human possibilities for economy coexist at any time, but particular forms of them become dominant and are often elevated to exclusive dominance in ideology or theory. But the fact is that all the different ways in which human beings have and perhaps might organize their economic affairs continue to exist side by side, and it can be one of our programs to explore new institutional emphases and combinations between them. That's the line that I take. But also, I have to say that I think that Marx and Weber are looking a lot better than they did until recently as a result of the... they always look good to me, but I think that I think Weber in particular comes out of it as actually a more subtle and interesting variant of Polanyi, and of course the rereading of Marx is another essential task for us. So let me kind of summarize. How can we identify the social forces that have grown up in the last period of national capitalism, and what role might they play in any new period, phase, or whatever? I mean, the first most important one is that we're living through the period when capital became globalized for the first time. I don't mean that capital traversed the world for the first time, but that significant capital was accumulated in many parts of the world for the first time, and not simply by Americans and Europeans. Now, it may well be that Brazil, Russia, India, and China will seize this moment of institutional weakness in the North Atlantic community, you might say, to launch their own variants of national capitalism. That would be perfectly predictable. I think one of the things that occupies me, if only at a journalistic level, is to try and figure out who the winners and losers are likely to be in this period when it shakes down. I'm absolutely sure that America will not be a loser, but I think the permanent and major loser of this crisis will be Europe. I think that the European political economy is unsustainable. The single currency offers a rigidity that means that countries like Austria, Spain, Ireland are being thrown to the wolves to save the Germans' notion of what fiscal probity should be. Eastern Europe is a disaster, and it's unlikely that the Western Europeans will do much about it. They're not even, the Northern Western Europeans are not so sure whether they're going to rescue what I sometimes think of as Club Med, the Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain, and so on. So, and they don't have a political mechanism, even constitutionally, never mind practically, to deal with the forces that have been unleashed. And of course, the Europeans were grotesquely overexposed in the emerging markets, especially in Latin America and Eastern Europe. So, and you know, they can't reproduce themselves. They hate the people who come to work for them. They cling to their stupid little sovereignty and national identity above all other things. And I really think that by the time it's all shaken up, Europe will be off the map. The second thing that I would refer to is one of the major developments of the last 30 years has been the rise of federated regional trading blocs, like the European Union, NAFTA, ASEAN, MERCOSUR, and so on. It's my great hope that the Africans might even be able to draw on their traditions of Pan-Africanism to form a more effective union in this respect. But all of this move towards trading blocs is a recognition of the inadequacy of nation-states for managing relations with the global economy. And so it represents, I think, an interesting example of the principle of federation, which might be posed constructively against the national monopolies that we've been more familiar with. Much of my work is concerned with the impact on the forms of money and exchange of the internet revolution. I can't say a great deal about this here, although I've written quite a lot about it. What I believe is that the digital revolution is rapidly making new combinations of personal and impersonal aspects of society possible, and it's doing so through one of the great moments in economic history when a significant commodity is radically cheapened. I mean, in the first industrial revolution, the significant commodity was textiles. In this one, it's the transfer of information. And I do believe that the cheapening of the cost of transferring information carries with it radical consequences for the organization of almost everything, but especially forms of organizing money, markets, association, and so on, communication on the internet. I believe that this, I mean, I moved from Cambridge to Paris in the late 90s, and I thought, well, you know, if I'm going to lose the benefits of a cushy institutional life, and in order to occupy an attic in Paris, then I ought to sort of have, you know, write about something significant. So I asked myself what it is that future generations will be interested in us for. Why would anybody in future be interested in us? And I do believe that this moment in which we explore the first stages of of the development of a universal system of communications in the history of humanity has a significance parallel with that of the invention of agriculture. And if you use the invention of agriculture as an analogy for the situation that we may have stumbled into, then obviously it takes place over a time period which massively extends beyond our own lifetime experience. So the way that I think of it, however, is that we are like the first digging stick operators who began scratching in the ground. They had absolutely no idea what Chinese civilization was, even though it was entailed somehow in this move, and nor do we. But nevertheless, we have this historic opportunity to make huge mistakes and even some small successes. And I think that's how we should think of it. That we should be modest in what we seek to achieve, but we should also realize that social forms are emerging at enormous speed, that we should insert ourselves into, learn from, and consider the possibilities of. And that's more or less what I've been doing. I wrote a book on money a decade ago called The Memory Bank, and since then I've been working quite extensively on alternative forms of money, complementary currencies, community currencies, open money, call them what you like. I have spent a good deal of time with, I think, a genius in this field, Michael Linton, who invented the first local exchange systems in 1982-3 in Vancouver Island. I do believe that the collapse of the banks, as long as we can make sure that Goldman Sachs loses their grip over the American government, offers an unrivaled opportunity, and I think the soon-to-be revealed failure of the central banks to act effectively opens up a tremendous moment for us to explore new principles of association through trading circuits and money. And all of those, I think, are entailed in this digital revolution in communications. Finally, of course, there is the issue of the global institutions. I mean, it's clear that for a long time, the Bretton Woods institutions have served only the purposes of a few Western capitalist nations, and in many cases only the United States. They urgently need reform, but I'm not sure whether the reforms that are needed will arrive before a significant deterioration of the peace. I know that presently journalists and academics and intellectuals think about the parallels between our situation and the 1930s. What worries me is the parallels between our situation and the end of the last period of 3 decades of globalization and financial imperialism in 1913-14. Market fundamentalism is dead, that's for sure. Maybe Keynesianism is too soon. One obvious contender to fill the void is environmentalist ideology, green thinking. Clearly that is stirring, and it has a focus in global warming, in the need to conserve water and many other scarce resources. I haven't said much about this green ideology and its potential in the period that is coming up, partly because I'm very much aware of its roots in rather pernicious phases of our history. I mean, it comes out of that Aristotelian synthesis that supported the rule by the military landlord class for millennia. The pioneers of green programs in 20th century Europe, as you know, were the Nazis. And I do believe that the intimate relationship between the ideology and theory of nationalism and the nation state and green ideology need to be examined perhaps more critically than they often are. I also hope that anthropology, which for too long has been trapped in a fragmentary, in ethnographic fragmentation, might lead that we might be able to generate as one offshoot or complement to the academic discipline an interdisciplinary move to develop new ways of identifying what we need to know about humanity as a whole if we are to make a better world. I think that if I can summarize my relationship to all of this as an anthropologist, is that I believe that anthropology has its sort of Kantian mission to illuminate the world society that we may or may not succeed in making. And it has always been that to some degree, never more strongly than in the century of his birth, in the 18th century Enlightenment, when it was linked directly to the transcendence of unequal society and the formation of more equal and democratic societies. So I hope that, without wishing to claim that all anthropology should be concerned with this, I think a program similar perhaps to a program like development studies or area studies that is able to mobilize intellectuals from a number of disciplines might be able to take up this question as its object and perhaps inform a world which has greater staying power than the one we've got at present.
So, I don't know what the best way to coordinate questions should be. Keith, do you want to field them? Shall I direct from over here? Or you may not be able to see them.
I like you being protected. I like being protected.
Okay, alright, I'll keep the bad guys.
I take it you see the internet as the prohibitor of the descent back into the Dark Ages, which you find in Colin Murphy's Are We Rome, a reworking of Gibbon for a contemporary unified world. And you say that this is the first unified, but the unified known world is actually Rome. And I take your argument to mean that it's the internet that's going to continue to prevent the creation of isolated units of Middle Age culture and civilization, so far as church is present. So the internet is a counter to that reworking of the Gibbon Colin Murphy Are We Rome argument that we're bound to descend into smaller units of organization. You said something about that. Just a question in respect to the Gibbon Murphy argument about, and a lot of other people, that we have a kind of dark ages coming upon us again. The second question is, what about something like the American military that has 175 or 180 bases throughout the world? How does this military establishment figure into your analysis?
Okay. My method has been to look at some of the institutional developments that we encounter, and not to make predictions about which of them will necessarily prevail, but to identify them in terms of their democratic potential. I mean, many of the developments of the internet give considerable power to banks and large corporations and governments and so forth, and not necessarily to bottom-up and decentralized organization. So, without wishing to make a prediction as to whether we will win or not, I do, yes, believe that the digital revolution in communications has the potential to spawn significant initiatives in this area, which I could be more specific about. It's not just the internet, of course. I mean, mobile telephony in places like Africa have been bursting out in all kinds of interesting ways, for the very good reason that mobile phones, uniquely of the new technologies, have a built-in payment system. The internet does not have a built-in payment system, and that's one of its liabilities. I mean, Twitter is all the rage, but they're losing money. And generally speaking, yes. I mean, without wishing to predict that we will avoid the Dark Ages, if we wish to, it seems to me that there are some promising developments. Moreover, I mean, in the last 30 or years or more, I mean, the internet grew up as an association of military bureaucrats and academics for several decades. In other words, it was the kind of epitome of the old regime. And it's only kind of escaped from that in the early 90s. So, you know, so yes, without wishing to be Panglossian about it, I am hopeful in that respect. You asked about the American military, which would probably require another lecture from Marshall Salins, but I mean, I can give you, you know, if you want, but you don't, where World War III is going to break out, and you know, well, I'll tell you now, it's going to break out in Afghanistan, Pakistan, which has the great opportunity of being next door to Russia, India, China, the Muslim world, and where, you know, the Americans and the Europeans already have substantial military build-up. So, I mean, it's my belief that that national capitalism will not go down peacefully, and that the American military will be an agent of the reaction, if you like.
We have a question in the back. Yep.
I have a question about the American Civil War. So you characterize the American Civil War as a bourgeois liberal revolution against the slave-owning aristocracy. But I'm just wondering in what sense we can characterize the Confederacy as a slave-owning aristocracy. They certainly did own slaves, but they did so in a very different manner than, say, the ancient Greek slave-owning society. I mean, the Confederacy was essentially a commodity-producing society, and the slave was yet another commodity.
Yeah, I mean, that was a gross oversimplification. I was sort of summarizing Marx's journalism on the American Civil War for the New York Post at the time. And I'm sure that any American historian would be able to give a more nuanced picture. But I think the general argument why Marx, and I don't claim this as a factual record of American history, why Marx thought the American Civil War was the decisive victory in what he called the bourgeois revolution was because it was a victory for the free labor system, the wage labor system, on which he developed, to which he devoted a great deal of attention. And I'm not an expert on the period, but the trigger for the war, which was whether some of the new Western states should be permit slave owning or not, with consequences for the balance of power in the Senate, I think were informed by some of these considerations, if not in the simple way that I suggested. All that I was trying to point out, however, is that that kind of Marxist industrial capitalist story kind of bypasses another one that was practically and has been practically very significant in the history of this city and New York and many others around the world, which is the power and efficacy of criminal capitalist gangs operating outside the purview of the state. And I only just wanted to point out that what I was trying to say was that Scorsese's fiction drew attention to the significance of that in the context of a war that has often been described in rather different terms.
Which role do you see for the labour movement in the developments of the global situation?
Well, yes. I mean, surely the. If I would have to tell the whole story. The labour movement was a major contributor to the first phase of national capitalism and the pressure for the development of welfare state, social security, and so on. The labour movement was also significant in the Second 30 Years' War, and it reached its apogee, as it were, in the period of social democracy after 1945. Now, this leads us then to asking what happened in the 1970s. And there are different analyses of that. But it looks like that the kind of class compromise between capital and labour and government that was engineered after the war, really on the backs of working people winning the war, was first of all challenged and threatened and then overthrown in the revolution that we associate with Thatcher and Reagan. Now, why the labour movement has been so thoroughly weakened in the last 3 decades is another interesting question. But one of the, certainly within the framework of neoliberal capitalism, wages have stagnated or regressed. The pattern of employment has shifted from stable and secure long-term employment to poorly paid, fragmentary and casualized work, and so on and so forth. So, I think that the labour, my answer is I don't know, and it's something that I haven't drawn a lot of attention to in my own work, mainly because, you know, I mean, I have been in my life a Marxist, and I'm very sensitive to Marxist arguments, and there are lots of people ready to say, you know, what's all this about the services economy? Industrial manufacturing is still as important as ever. You know, work and labour is the key to the politics of everything. And I say, yeah. You know, go on studying Facebook and Twitter. But I think it's a very good question, and I'd be interested if anyone else or you wish to make a point about it.
All of the previous stages to the coming one that you analyzed were in terms of class relations and the struggles of different classes. My question is, what do you think is the vanguard of the coming era? Are we now in a classless or a different kind of struggle than all the previous eras?
Well, the way that I approach that is by asking if the classes of classical political economy persist in our world, and that is land, labour and money, landlords, workers and capitalists. And I think they do. Certainly the landlord function has evolved to the nation-state forms of government as I've been describing. Capital has evolved to the scale of large corporations in some uneasy relationship with those governments. And so then the question is, what is the third category? Labour, workers, people in general. And Marx and Engels' line on this was to argue that there were some sectors of the world economy which were forward-looking and dynamic, and that the classes being formed there, in particular the industrial proletariat, would play a decisive role in the future. I think, you know, they were mistaken on that. So, but what I would like to retain is the logic of the inquiry, which is, where are the vanguard sectors of the world economy today, and who are the people, you know, sort of moving them, and could you claim that these might be some elite capable of pushing things forward and making an alliance with others? And, you know, so in other words, I mean, you know, the answer would be, if it were yes, that it's the wired, you know, the geeks, the people who are pushing open source and free software and trying to create conditions of liberal association on the internet against all the constraints levied against them. But then, you know, I asked myself, well, maybe the history of maybe the history of the last 150 years is not the best analogy for us. What if world society, in its decadence and inequality and violence, has become something pretty similar to the old regime before the French Revolution, French and American revolutions? And what if the only viable response to that is a liberal revolution? What were the liberal revolutions? These liberal revolutions were basically a ragtag and bobtail army of all kinds of dissident elements, you know, diggers and whoever else, in the English case, Garibaldi's army and another one. But in every case, in the American, English, French and Italian liberal revolutions, capital played a very major part. The slave capitalists of Bordeaux and Nantes, and so on and so forth. And so that then raises the question, where are we in the history of capitalism? And my belief is not very far. I mean, I have no time for people who say capitalism is on is dying, it's on its last legs. It might be dying, in some parts of Europe and North America, but it's busting out in many other places. And if, as Hegel said, the world historical mission of capitalism is to bring cheap commodities to the masses and break down the traditional insularity of rural communities, well, it's still the case that 2 billion people work with their hands in the fields, and 2 billion people have never made a phone call in their life. And who is going to produce that for them? Some Sandinista movement? Who's going to throw up a satellite for them? So my view has been for some time that the class analysis has to identify within capital some fragments that would be supportive of a general liberal revolution of the kind that might be necessary. And there are. I mean, if you take the key industries like, the internet-based industries, a firm like Sony or Warner Brothers constitutes feudal barons of the most extreme kind, trying to impose ancient restrictions on the use of these commodities. But others, like Hewlett-Packard, for example, a long time ago decided that they would try and reach the 4 billion poorest people on the planet, which meant that they would have to establish research stations in China and Africa and so on, capable of adapting these new technologies devised for markets such as this to those purposes. So, I know it's a long-winded answer, but it's a great question, and I think there are several ways of going about it, but you have to have a sort of theory of history to be able to answer it. And mine is that capitalism is actually entering into a vigorous period of its development, but no longer controlled by the West, and that that it is creating a constituency for a liberal revolution. That's my belief. Not against capital, but with some parts of it.
Okay, so we have 3 questions that have been waiting. One in the back. Okay, so we have 3 questions that have been waiting. One in the back, then Jim and Michael. So, yeah.
I know Polanyi talks about sort of the fall of commodity money and replacing it with this concept of purchasing power money. The forms of money that you were talking about, working with community money and all of these things, would you say that they fall into the category of purchasing power money, or are they something completely different?
Well, you've asked me a hybrid question that is difficult for me to answer, because the first part of it requires me to talk about how I conceive of the relationship between what Polanyi called token and commodity money. But I'll skip that for the moment. Briefly, the main contrast between existing currency forms and the alternative forms that I've been interested in and explored is that the forms we're familiar with are issued by single agents, and the forms that I'm interested in are issued by participants, plurally. In other words, people create money by means of making promise to repay, if you like, in the future. There's no question that the aim of these currencies is to increase purchasing power.
Sounds like credit defaults.
Well, I mean, you know, I can hardly... I mean, one of the things that I found in this, I mean, people like Michael, who has devoted his life, or should I say, wasted his life, to a vision of money as being inevitable, that kills us all in various small and big ways. I mean, when I try and talk about this, I immediately provoke derision and you know, and so on from people who actually can't afford to inspect their own assumptions about money. And it's very difficult to persuade people in a couple of sentences at this late time in our association of what the principles are and how they work. But you were asking me basically whether they were purchasing power. They fell in Polanyi's classification of money as purchasing power monies, and I would say yes, but perhaps that's not the most important feature of them.
Jim and Mike.
I want to go back to gangs, and it seems to me that we're seeing in this ferment that we live through now an expansion, a plethora of gang kinds of activities on a global scale. And I'm wondering if you could, you know, comment on if that's in fact not an exaggeration. How you see this in relationship to the transition you see going on.
So I've missed the question.
How you see the relationship of this expansion of gang, or this
Expansion of
gang activity.
Gang. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
That's
as you say, you know, as Oscar Wilde said, the Americans and the English are divided by a common language. Okay, sorry.
So back to that Scorsese moment.
Yeah.
Gang and the state.
Yeah.
Gang and the state relationship. Where are we now in that? How do you see that operating?
Well, I think that the neoliberal period and its commitment to deregulation and the diminishing power of states to control especially international commerce and capital flows gave rise to a radical informalization of the global economy. I'll tell you, about one of my gangs, if you like. I mean, I know a gang in Marseille and Montpellier of North Africans who basically boost cars, especially German cars, and car parts, and sell them throughout Africa. And they have a strongly Islamic ideology and practice. They never use any paper or any kind of visible manifestation of their transactions. It's all words. The level of their trade has reached a point where the French spare parts industry, Renault, Peugeot and Co., has moved south to meet the demand. Except you would never understand from the official statistics why there was this migration of capacity towards a non-existent demand. Recently, these gangs have hooked up with Russian and Latin American mafias, and they've expanded into Brussels and Hamburg. In the latter case, as a much more reliable place.
Are they listed on NASDAQ? Are they listed on NASDAQ?
Well, I mean, the question arises: how do you find out about and study these phenomena? Or, I mean, to take another one which has been referred to, the Mourides of Senegal, who are following of a 1920s Sufist saint who control a large amount of the street trade in Southern Europe and New York and other places. I mean, at one time in the in the last decade, I mean, they supplied a large number of the shoes into North America through Harlem, and decided to switch their sources from Italy to China, with profound effects on the Italian national economy. So what I'm saying is that the kind of gangs that played such a prominent part in 19th and early 20th century American economic history, and perhaps even still do if you watch The Sopranos, I mean, this phenomenon, the criminal organization of unregulated trade, is enormous. I mean, the opium trade coming out of Afghanistan through Iran has wrecked that country. I mean, there is a war going on between gangs running the opium and various state army factions, and a large amount of it is staying in Iran, and people are getting blasted on it. And so I think that I think in the last 30 years or so, the conditions for criminal commerce have expanded radically, and we're not even talking about former Soviet army, gun runners into Angola and the Congo and all that sort of stuff. I mean, it's huge.
I have perhaps a simple question, which is a phrase that you used in passing. I found fascinating, and I can't quite solve the problem myself. So I'd like your help. You at one point talked about national capitalism or its opposite.
Yeah.
What is its unique opposite?
Sorry. What I was referring to was a style of political reasoning, if you like, which seeks to envision a future which in some ways is the negation of a stylized version of the present, so that we will make the leap from capitalism to something post-capitalist, non-capitalist, or whatever. And I was contrasting with that trope, if you like, a vision that says that all forms of economy coexist with different emphasis, and that if we're moving in a new direction, it will not be it won't be to social forms that are in some radical sense new. In other words, I mean, the analytical question for me is, what is it that national capitalism has become for us, which is not necessarily an integrated or functional or coherent thing, but what are the elements that it has, sustained? And I mentioned some of them, and how can we conceive of new forms of political association, new combinations of economic strategy that are adequate to our dilemmas. That was...
So it's the complement, in a sense, in some universe of possibilities for possible economic worlds, you might say, that you're talking about. It's not the opposite.
I'm saying that, I'm talking again... the way that some writers like Marx, for example,
Take a random example.
to take a random example, say, you know, first we had feudalism, then we had capitalism, then we have whatever. Hegel, on the other hand, and a number of others said, well, you know, family-based organization related to the land, urban commerce, state politics, all these things, you know, have a different relationship and structure of ascendancy and so on at different times. But they coexist, and so we have to devise ways of combining them. And I was really just, without having anything specific in mind, I mean, there are people, I mean, the anarchist wing of the internet society is quite strong in one form or another.
They're mostly libertarians, though.
They're libertarians, but they also talk about a non-capitalist future.
Notwithstanding they're libertarians. That's to say they imagine it in a market form.
Well, some of them weirdly imagine they're anti-market too. David Graeber, for example. You know,
Larry Lessig.
Larry Lessig, yes. Well, I mean, what interests me, Larry Lessig is a very good case. I mean, you know, I think that, I think that the struggle over intellectual property rights is one of the concentrated arenas of class and other institutional struggle, and I'm, you know, part of it. I mean, every time that I publish an article,
A good patent lawyer who's really worrying about this.
but the thing that I worry about with Creative Commons licenses is that it reproduces the license culture.
Sure, that's the point.
Yeah. And in the end, it makes work for lawyers, and I'm not sure that this is, you know,
So
the future that I want to buy
There's
into.
a class fraction interest.
Exactly.
Right. Well, following on this nourishment, I think the time is right for refreshments. So.